Talk of the Bay. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman, and I'm speaking with Stephen Zunes. He's a professor and an observer of both local and international affairs. And we're here to talk with him about the post-midterm election, if you can call it that. We're still really waiting for a lot of results, but I thought I would get your first impressions of the night on Tuesday. What do you think was learned, if anything?
I think it is indicative that the pundits and pollsters missed something very important, and that was the fact that young people are much more engaged than they used to be in the electoral process. On the one hand, and I'm speaking of this as someone who's been a college professor for of 35 years now, that this generation is more politically engaged than any we've seen in recent years. Now, ironically, they are also very skeptical of the system. In many respects, they are more radical than a lot of their peers, but they also recognize the importance of being involved, at least tactically, in the electoral process. And the numbers were that they came out to vote at much larger numbers than at any off-year election in history. And this is youth turnout is the one that is least consistent. Young people tend to vote in lower numbers than other voters, but not this time. They came out in solid numbers, and they voted by greater than 2-1 margin in support of the Democrats.
And do you think choice was the main driver in that decision to go out and vote?
It was a big one, to be sure, but there are other issues as well. I mean, they have the concerns that led many other progressive voters to the polls, including climate, racial injustice, immigration, and of course the threat to democracy that the Republicans are increasingly are putting forward. I mean, indeed, the very reason that the Republican Party has been engaged in such active voter repression efforts is they see the numbers as well. They see this younger generation is more progressive, more diverse, and their electoral prospects in the coming years are not looking good as this generation gets older, and so they have a real stake in limiting ballot access and trying to hold on to power by whatever means necessary. Despite the stereotype, people do not actually get that and turn conservative as they get older. We found that statistically, the data is very clear that people more or less will keep their general orientation politically of what they were between the ages of 18 and 30. And yes, they're former leftists who become conservative, but pretty much an equal amount of former conservatives get more liberal. I mean, some people might be less extreme. I mean, I know plenty of people who were, militant Marxists in their youth who are now more social democrats or liberals, but they haven't switched to the other extreme. And similar, we saw, of course, in the 1980s when that was one of when younger voters were actually more conservative than the average Americans. I mean, this is the generation that gave us the Marco Rubios and Ted Cruzes and other of the Republican leaders that are in power right now. That the Reagan youth generation, they've remained more conservative. So this trend towards a more progressive electorate has a lot to do with, again, the increased diversity of the younger U.S. population. Is something that I think, despite the worries of the threats to democracy we have right now, is something that we're going to see continuing, and indeed they saved the day in terms of preventing a huge Republican tsunami in last Tuesday's election.
Much was made about the sort of moment we were in at the midterms being kind of a democracy vote. And it was very high on many people's list when they went out to vote at the polls. And there was a lot of worry, and maybe it's too early to say that there isn't much reason for worry, because there are challenges being made and a lot of scrutiny on a couple of races that are still pending. But in some cases, people are saying this is the most consequential election in history because of the threats that were made to poll workers and also the number of people running for various places, like Attorney General, who were election deniers. So what do you make of the outcome versus the trepidation factor?
Yes, there were certainly concerned that some candidates for governor and Secretary of State and other positions that which actually have a say in the running of elections had a chance of winning in some key swing states. Arizona and Nevada are still pending on those, but in the other states, the more hardcore election deniers, at least in positions in state government, were defeated. Unfortunately, a fair number of members of Congress were elected or reelected, but that were election deniers. But at least those who actually had the power to impact the outcome in certain states seem to have gone down in defeat. And I think there are. A fair, not just Democrats are concerned about that, but even some fair-minded Republicans are rather disturbed about that. We did have some Republicans who actually endorsed Democrats in these kinds of races because despite their ideological support of conservative causes, they still nevertheless had faith in democracy. But I think one thing is this kind of illustrates a broader point I wanted to bring up here, and that is we'd hear a lot about polarization in American society, and a lot of us scoff at that because people are saying, "Oh, you have these conservative Republicans, you have these left-wing Democrats," and in fact, if there's no comparison, the Democratic Party is still decidedly mainstream. It's not nearly as far to the left as Republicans are to the right at this point. But even putting that aside, the assumption that a polarization, would necessarily means the rise of fascism and the far right is something I'm less concerned about than others, and the reason is that yes, it could happen, but another scenario is possible as well. I think as George Leahy and some others have pointed out, if you look at times of polarization in history, let's take Europe in the 1930s. You had an enormous amount of inequality and changes in society that were led rise to the fascist movements and ended up taking over in Spain and Italy and Germany. And yet this is also the time where you had the social democratic revolutions in Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Finland. The rise of these still very well functioning political and economic systems that are quite progressive. I remember back then, Scandinavia was as conservative and unequal and problematic as anywhere. Think of all the Norwegian immigrants and others who came to North America at that time. And similarly, in the 1930s, you had the rise of neo-Nazis. They had enough people to fill Madison Square Garden. The America First Committee and the lynchings in the South and the Ku Klux Klan and running vast areas of the southeastern United States. Yet this is also the period that brought us the New Deal and great social progress. Let's think of the 60s, another time of polarization. I mean, people forget the neo-Nazis had something of a comeback during that period as well. Again, the night riders and the church bombings and all that horror going on in the South. And yet this was the time of the civil rights victories, the rise of black and brown power movements, the second wave of feminism, the origins of the environmental movement and LGBTQ activism. That times of polarization such as this are definitely times of threats from the far right, but it also leads to potential for great progress. I mean, if you want to use the analogy of a blacksmith or a metallurgy, I mean, you cannot shape the metal unless it's hot, and you can turn it into a gun or sword or something that can do damage, or you can turn it, into a piece of art or horseshoes or something very practical and useful. And we're in a time where things are getting pretty hot right now,
They
and
are.
things could go either way.
They are definitely getting hot. I'm speaking with Stephen Zunes here on Talk of the Bay on K-Squid. Right at the moment we're having our midterm election, there's the COP summit happening in Egypt. And I couldn't help wonder how much was discussed during the election about climate change. It almost seems like it's hard for us to focus on both things, or the candidates were not really focusing heavily on that. I'm wondering what's your take on the timing. It should have been front page news that all these leaders were heading there and not ours. But what's your take on the response during this election to the growing threat that the head of the UN says is, really needs immediate action and the window's closing? So what's your sense of how much was discussed about this?
It was very disappointing that it wasn't a bigger issue in the midterm elections. Indeed, if you look back at the presidential elections, I mean, there's barely a question about it in the presidential debates, and really not given that it really is the existential issue of our time. The way that it's not being addressed is quite disturbing, particularly when you have denial by the one of the two major parties, and only half-hearted responses really from a good chunk of the Democratic Party. Again, this is an area where the young people are particularly important. We see the Sunrise Movement and others emerging, pressing this issue more and more. But I think what we're going to have to do is in another number of cutting-edge issues of our time, in which the political system, the two-party system, isn't addressing it. There's going to have to be nonviolent direct action and other movement, activism by civil society that has to force the issue to be into the forefront, so it does become part of electoral campaigns, and it should be a winning issue for the Democrats. I mean, people don't. Everybody has a stake in the planet's survival, and what's kind of interesting is, despite the efforts of the extractive industries and corporate interests that benefit from the status quo to try to sow doubts into its urgency and try to downplay things, more enlightened sectors of capital recognize that this is really the way we need to go, that the future of the economy is going to be on renewable energy. They don't want the Chinese, who, despite the serious problems in their system, tend to look further than the bottom line in the next quarter, like American corporations tend to do. Then they are looking in the longer term and are going, to be, pioneering the new technologies that are going to drive things forward in the world in the coming decades. And there are enlightened sectors of the American elites and others who recognize this and are pushing for more action as well. So I do think that this is going to have to be a greater issue, and it's really a shame that this time around it did not get nearly the attention it deserved.
I'm speaking with Stephen Zunes, a professor and also expert in international studies. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman, and this is K-Squid's Talk of the Bay. Just staying for a moment more on the climate change, we have Biden meeting with the head of China during a time when China and Russia are still kind of palsy-walsy about petrochemical dollars and the purchase thereof. The head of India just said, well, we need to buy cheap gasoline for our countrymen, so we're going to keep dealing with Russia. So how is the war in Ukraine playing out against all of this backdrop of trying to get action on climate, and at the same time there's sort of an energy war percolating, and we're in Egypt with the climate conference at the same time. So it's complicated, isn't it?
Oh yeah, I mean the Russian invasion of Ukraine is tragic on a whole number of levels, including the fact that it's been used as an excuse for increasing coal production, reviving nuclear power, including giving an extension on the life of the dangerous Diablo Canyon plant down the coast here, and also, diverting both the attention of governments as well as their financial resources to an ongoing war, rather than the looking at alternative energy. At the same time, I think it has underscored how important it is not to be dependent on authoritarian petrostates, whether that be Putin's Russia or whether that be Saudi Arabia or other authoritarian regimes. And for many people, that has underscored the urgency of looking for alternative sources of energy.
That's right. That's right. And you point to, that the governments aren't acting fast enough for the younger generation, so they're hitting the streets. What do you see as there's a vast middle of people who are just watching in horror, right? There's the people in power. There's the young folks who have, feel like their whole future's at stake. And then there's this swath of people in the middle just, trying to buy a Prius maybe or electric car. What do you think will happen if the middle joins the youth in this case of demanding action on climate change? Would that be a game changer?
Yeah, very much so. And of course, we've seen this before. That middle-class Americans who didn't really want to think much about the Vietnam War until the youth protests and others made it so it was hard to ignore anymore. And the civil rights struggle, which and if you go back far enough, the labor movements in the 30s. I mean, often it does take the popular protest and to force things into the consciousness of that important middle sector. And again, the thing about the climate is that everybody is negatively impacted. Obviously, the poor and vulnerable more so, but no one is safe. And that was the big emphasis on during the big struggles around nuclear disarmament as well. The Holly, as the Holly song goes, "Ain't nowhere you can run. No, ain't nowhere you can run." And that's certainly the case with with the climate crisis that we are dealing with. I mean, the smoky skies here are. I mean, have just in the 25 years that I've lived in Santa Cruz, the acreage burned in California has doubled. The number of days unsafe air quality because of fires has tripled. I mean, we're facing this in a very real way. And it's important that we emphasize the reasons that this is happening. This is not simply a natural phenomenon, and that people have to become active. Otherwise, it's just going to get worse.
A lot of my friends, I end up in these very strange conversations where it's all about where would you move if you wanted to be in the safest place, and it seems like a kind of a escapist conversation, to tell you the truth, in a literal way, like looking for the best safe place for you and your family to be, because, like you said, it's not something you can bank on. Sure, you can look at maps, but it seems to detract from the real conversation, which is how do we get out of this mess quickly enough? It seems to be baked into our future regardless, and the worst of it coming after people our age are gone. But nonetheless, we're, even in the next 20 years, are going to live through some pretty tough stuff, like you said, forest fires and other things. So how do we shift the conversation over to demanding political action from our leaders, or maybe just going our own way and creating structures beyond and around our governmental agencies?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, you have to address it on a whole number of levels, and I mean, it's obviously, if you can afford it, it's obviously good to move towards electric vehicles, and of course, recycling and all this kind of stuff is worthwhile. We all have to do our part, but I get a little I don't want people to overemphasize that, because individuals can do uh, all that they can, while you still have corporate America and the military-industrial complex continuing to dump carbon into the atmosphere. Indeed, I just want to emphasize this is an important piece that people don't realize that the U.S. military is the #1 carbon emitter in the world, and hardly anybody's talking about that. The Iraq War alone dumped over 800 million tons of additional carbon into the atmosphere. And among the many other tragedies that resulted from that war, which Joe Biden, Dianne Feinstein, Chuck Schumer, and a lot of other prominent Democrats supported. Not only did it destroy Iraq and result in over 1 million casualties, and not only did it lead the creation of ISIS and other extremists, it's contributed quite a bit to the warming of the planet. Just think how much carbon is emitted by one C-130 transport plane, and delivering these tanks and everything to the other side of the world. The fact we have these far-flung, military bases. We have, hundreds and hundreds of jet fighters in the air at any one time. We really are going to have to tackle the military-industrial complex if we're going to tackle climate change. And I think it's really critical that the environmental movement and the anti-war movement work together to recognize this piece. And obviously, I think we are on the one hand, we can't just trust the electoral system. And we got to do more than just vote for liberal Democratic candidates. We do need to have a nonviolent direct action component. We do need to have very much of a grassroots component. At the same time, it's also critical that we need to support candidates, no matter how imperfect, that may be better than the Republican alternative when it comes to these environmental issues. Rebecca Solnit says it really well, that voting is a chess move, not a Valentine. That we need that. One can be as skeptical of the system and of the Democratic Party as one can be, but at the same time recognize that they're not all the same. That the lesser evil is still less evil, and that we need to have a two-pronged strategy. Yes, be out there on the streets, be willing to take what it takes in terms of nonviolent direct action. And get arrested if you have to, do whatever you can, but it's also important to show up at the voting booth. And despite the fact that the Republicans may now will be likely taking over the House of Representatives, and may even have a shot at taking over the Senate as well, depending on the outcome, it defied history. This is in the sense that it was the least gains of an opposition party in an off-year election when there is an incumbent president in almost any election since 1934, which I think is both a reflection of the extremism of the Republican Party that scared off a lot of people, but as I noted earlier, the mobilization of young people, minority voters, and others who generally don't show up in as big numbers as usual, who recognize the urgencies of the tasks before us, and including addressing climate change.
That's right. I'm speaking with Professor Stephen Zunes. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman, and this is Talk of the Bay. In the time we have left, I thought we would pivot a little bit to what this might mean for Joe Biden's future. He says, we intend to run. We've always intended to run. But then quite a few people would like someone different. What are your thoughts on if this means anything, if this midterm, sets in motion anything? We've already heard, Ron DeSantis being lauded as the next great conservative, but what about on the Democratic side of the aisle?
Well, the fact that the Democrats didn't do nearly as badly as expected will lead, I think, Biden's supporters to claim some credit for that, and it will help those that do hope that he runs for a second term. But exit polls show that the majority of Democrats, actually 2-1, are wishing that he not run. I mean, that's an unprecedented number, frankly. And I think it's and I'm hoping that Biden and the Democratic leadership will take that seriously. He's not that popular. I mean, part of it is his age and how that impacts his communication skills. Even though this shouldn't be as much a factor as it is, having a charismatic leader does make a difference. But also, his policies, his centrist policies, don't enthuse the base as much as they should. I mean, a lot of people, despite the Republicans saying that Biden is this radical socialist and that kind of thing, I mean, issue by issue, he is much more conservative than most Democrats, not just on foreign policy, where he supported the Iraq War, record high military spending, supports the Israeli and Moroccan occupation, and our aid to various allied dictatorships and the like. But on domestic issues, where he's opposed the Green New Deal, where he's opposed universal health care, Medicare for all, and the kind of domestic priorities that most, not just the majority of Democrats, but depending on the issue, even the majority of Americans support. And
Stephen Zunes joining us here on Talk of the Bay. Coming up next, it's an interview with Franz Lonting. Stay tuned for the kooky side of crazy coming up at 6 o'clock here on KSQD Santa Cruz. I'm Rachel Ann Goodman.